Praise the Sentinel Wuwa players, we have finally obtained the power of God and anime on our side. Phoebe's the first character of Wuthering Waves 2.1 and one that I'm sure many people have been excited for. I think overall, everyone's feeling pretty enthusiastic about the 2.1 lineup. Besides just being a new character though, there's a lot to look into with her, because Phoebe's gameplay in and of itself represents an expansion to character capability, having one of the most complex and interactive kits in the game, and even working on one of the new universal mechanics they added to Wuwa in 2.0. We're going to be looking through all of that for today, analyzing Phoebe's abilities, rotations, sequences, builds, teams, you know, the usual stuff, and then giving my final thoughts on her role in the metagame, along with if she's worth pulling or not. Alright, so before we actually talk about Phoebe at length, there's a system I want to bring to attention first as kind of a preface. One of the new echo sets brought on in 2.0 is Eternal Radiance, a Spectro themed echo set with the potential to increase one's combat pressure more than Celestial Light, but only when meeting a certain condition. It shares the same 2-piece bonus effect as Celestial Light, but the full set effect grants 20% crit rate and 15% spectral damage by interacting with what is known as Spectro Frazzle, which is a debuff currently only applicable by Spectro Rover and our little Miss Phoebe. Functionally, it behaves as a dot effect, decreasing in stacks to periodically damage the target, with higher stacks increasing each tick of damage. Prior to 2.1, beyond Spectro Rover, this set was completely inaccessible due to our other Spectro attacker Tinci having no way of applying the debuff in question. A lost opportunity, as 20% crit rate is no small amount to have. Phoebe, on the other hand, does have the ability to apply this debuff, which is a big point of interest for her. What role does the Acolyte serve in combat? She actually has 2 roles, depending on what stance you take. In light of that, we'll open up with their Forte circuit, which might appear complicated at first, but like most Forte circuits, is pretty simple once you get the hang of it. In a similar fashion to Carlotta, Phoebe technically has 2 Forte gauges, the first one being Prayer, represented by the golden bar below the waveform, and the second one being Divine Voice, the waveform bar itself. Phoebe naturally generates Prayer every second, and when it's at full, you can enter one of 2 stances, Absolution and Confession. To enter Absolution, you have to perform a heavy attack, and to enter Confession, you need to hold her skill. Regardless, entering either stance will damage enemies and apply a Spectral Frazzle stack on them. In essence, Absolution is their DPS stance, and Confessions are quote-unquote support stance. These 2 modes influence the rest of her kit. Absolution is predicated on increasing Phoebe's personal DPS, while Confession is predicated on applying more Spectral Frazzle and increasing Frazzle damage. It's important to note that she can only choose one or the other at any given point in time and cannot have both active simultaneously. By the way, the stances last forever. To switch from one to another, you simply have to wait 24 seconds, which is the amount of time it takes for Prayer to fully charge up again. Now her second Forte gauge, Divine Voice. What that does depends on what stance you're in. First and foremost, you charge up your Divine Voice by entering Absolution or Confession, then you consume it while in either state. When using your third basic attack or dodging enemy attacks, your next use of heavy attack becomes empowered. In Absolution, said heavy attack deals significantly more damage against enemies affected by Spectral Frazzle. You can do 4 of these empowered attacks before exhausting your Divine Voice. In Confession, the heavy attack instead applies 5 Spectral Frazzle stacks. So to sum it up, her Forte gauge 1 builds up over time naturally to then allow you to activate one of her 2 stances, granting access to an empowered heavy attack that consumes her Forte gauge 2 to deal bonus damage or apply Frazzle. Doesn't sound too bad, right? We're gonna skip her resonance skill for a bit to talk about her liberation first, since I want to focus on the 2 stances while they're still relevant. Phoebe's liberation is just a screen nuke that has additional effects based on what stance you're in. When in Absolution, the ability does more damage, a lot more, like 3.5 times more. When in Confession, she applies 8 Frazzle stacks to all enemies hit. So once again, Absolution is the DPS mode, Confession is the support mode. There's one more part of her kit that's affected by what stance you're in, and that's her outro skill. Phoebe's outro, like most of the DPS units, is just an attack, but she gets an additional effect based on her mode. Absolution flat out makes her outro do even more damage. Confession, however, provides a buff to the active character to shred 10% spectral res of nearby enemies, as well as increase Spectral Frazzle's damage over time by 100%, effectively doubling it if it's the only source, and extend its duration by 50%. The buff holds out for 30 seconds or until Phoebe switches to Absolution, meaning if you want to maintain the buff, she has to stay in Confession the entire time. Okay, now we'll get to her skill. Phoebe's skill doesn't have differing effects based on her stance, but it does have differing effects based on how you use it. Phoebe damages and marks the target area in front of her, stunning enemies hit for 2 seconds, identical to the stun Carlotta has on her skill. Recasting the skill then teleports her to the center of the area for more spectral damage. You can compare it to Jojo's skill in that sense, a mark and teleport. Now comes the fun part. Phoebe gains different attacks based on how she interacts with this area. If she attacks from outside of the ring towards it, basic attacks will bounce and reflect inside of the ring to gain increased AoE and also pull enemies towards the center of it. In other words, Phoebe is the first character in Wuthering Waves to have consistent grouping. We have a couple units who can group like Jinshin, Shorekeeper, and Rocha, but Phoebe by far has the most accessible grouping capability in relation to how big it is and how active it is. On the other hand, attacking from inside gives Phoebe a new set of basic attacks that deal increased damage and have more range. I want to go on record to say she has arguably the most visually appealing animations in the game to date. So many elaborate shapes and light refractions, there's even a reference to the Star of David in there. Anyways, point being, two different modes. Attack from outside in, you get tons of grouping capability, attack from inside out, and you get more DPS. Simple enough. The cool thing about Phoebe's skill though is that the ring has a 30-second duration, but her skill has a 12-second cooldown. I believe she's the third character in Wuwa to have overflow uptime as well, the other two being Yuanwu and Shorekeeper I think. She can attack forever while in this state. I mean, granted her Forte is a fixed duration in that you can only do 4 empowered attacks in Absolution or 2 empowered attacks in Confession, but in terms of her skill she's got permanent uptime. Having established her 2 modes and the rest of her kit, let's go through each attack rotation, one for Absolution and one for Confession. Absolution's the more important one seeing as it's her DPS. You want to open up with Phoebe's intro skill, then use her Echo Active. Follow up with her skill 1 and skill 2 to establish the ring and teleport right into it. Then you want to activate her Absolution Forte by using a heavy attack. For the remainder of the rotation, you just basic attack 1, 2, 3, then heavy attack. Do that for a total of 4 times, and there you go, very straightforward. That's a rotation. For her liberation, you can technically do it anytime after entering Absolution since the only requisite is to be in Absolution. My recommendation is to use it right after entering Absolution just to get it out of the way since you don't want to be sitting at full energy. But if say you're not at full energy and you have to charge it, then you can use it at the end of the rotation before your outro as well. Her Confession rotation is more condensed. You want to intro, then skill, then enter Confession, then liberation, then Echo Active. Reason being, the Nightmare Morning Ix has increased power against enemies affected by Spectro Frazzle, so you want to wait until after Phoebe applies Frazzle to use it, and remember, Confession Liberation tacks on 8 stacks. Then you want to basic attack 1, 2, 3 and heavy attack. Do this twice just to keep Spectro Frazzle topped off at 10 stacks, and then you outro out and go to town on your attacker. The overall rotation is very similar between the two, it's just Absolution Phoebe you want to teleport into the ring and stay on field for 2 more cycles of basic attack. Everything else is the same. Okay, so probably the biggest question on everyone's mind is which mode is better, Absolution or Confession? Currently, the more effective one is Absolution, her DPS stats. Confession is serviceable mind you, but considering the only other unit who utilizes Spectral Frazzle is Spectral Rover, you're better off keeping Phoebe in Absolution. Although it does raise an interesting point about Phoebe in that there is merit to pulling her for future value. Seeing as how Spectral Frazzle is a new mechanic they added to Wuwa in 2.0, even going so far as to add an Echo set just for that, it's safe to assume they'll expand more on this mechanic in the coming months, maybe with another Spectral Frazzle DPS who's better than Rover, at which point that could be another incentive to pull for Phoebe. She's a powerful main DPS now, and then in the future she could acquire a secondary role in the form of a Spectral Frazzle secondary. Maybe having a Changli Yinlin type arrangement where it's a dual DPS comp. Just something to think about. How strong is Absolution Phoebe in relation to other meta-performing units? You'll be happy to know that Phoebe's comfortably chilling in top tier. Her personal DPS is around the same level as I would say Qinqi and Camellia, making her more than competitive. S0R1 Phoebe hangs around 1.1 million damage per rotation, she's extremely strong. Best of all, Phoebe's best secondary is a character we all have, Spectro Rover. I would say she's arguably the most free-to-play friendly 5-star DPS character in the game, and one of the easiest to build a team around. While on that note, we should quickly talk about her teams. Like I said, Spectro Rover is best in slot for her right now. They're the only other unit who can apply Spectro Frazzle, and also the only other unit who can take advantage of her Spectro Frazzle. For your third character, an easy one would be to go one of the Spectro Healers for better stability. Shorekeeper's crit boost is a natural given for any hyper carry attacker. However, though it's nowhere near as safe or casual friendly compared to a dedicated healer, given that Spectral Rover has their own healing capability, you can technically use another sub DPS unit like Sanhua or Mortefi instead of Arena or Shorekeeper. Why Sanhua and Mortefi? Phoebe's DPS is primarily split between basic and heavy attacks, roughly a 1-to-2 ratio, so increasing either is beneficial for you. By the way, even though she does more heavy attack damage than basic attack, Sanhua and Mortefi roughly end up around the same, if not Sanhua being a bit better, primarily because Phoebe already gives herself a ton of heavy attack damage, so Mortefi's a bit of a diminishing return. Either way, it's not that massive of a difference. Looking at the charts here, Sanhua and Mortefi average out to be around the same with only a 2-to-3% difference. I swear, Sanhua just gets more and more valuable with each passing character. So your most practical team would be to go for Sanhua and Spectro Rover. A convenient side effect of this is that we finally have 3 full meta teams for Tower of Adversity. Prior to 2.1, most players would only be able to comfortably complete 2 of the 3 chambers due to there only being 2 top tier healers, forcing the third party to play without one or with a suboptimal party arrangement making use of Baizhi or Yohu. Don't get me wrong, they're not bad. Bite 2 can be used for Carlotta, but their capabilities just don't quite measure up to Verena and Shorekeeper. Now though, we have a third endgame party that can be used at optimal efficiency. That's yet another reason to pull for Phoebe. She doesn't need either of the healers. On to sequences. S1 and S2 are more for quality of life purposes, helping her Absolution and Confession modes do their job even more effectively. For example, S1 makes her Confession Liberation apply the maximum Frazzle stacks to a target. The wording on her S1 has me believing, even though the max number of stacks is currently 10, in the future they could increase it to a higher number. Anyway, S2 pertains to her Outro skill, making it do more damage in both nodes, either making her own damage higher or the damage of Spectro Frazzle. But if you're willing to bust out the old Benjamins on Phoebe, S3 is where the sauce is. Her Forte and Power and Heavy attack increases by almost double, overall boosting her total DPS by over 25%. It's practically equivalent to Camellia's S2, where Phoebe's empowered Forte attack turns from an explosion into a tactical nuke. If you're thinking about investing in her beyond S0 R1, I would wholeheartedly recommend S3. The DPS boost is monumental. S4 is alright, it's a moderate amount of Spectral Shred for 30 seconds. Like I said, you're good to stop at S3, but considering Phoebe's the one hyper carry DPS in the game with the option to go a support role, this might not be too bad for future Spectro attackers. Although if you were at S4, my guess is you were already planning to get to the very end. S5 at this point has earned a reputation for being the most head-scratcher sequence on every character, usually having the lowest value on all of them, especially in proportion to the cost, but as stated earlier, if you're this far, you might as well finish it all the way. The final sequence is strange. It makes it so enemies entering the ring get the 2-second freeze, making it so even if they were outside of the ring beforehand, if they touch it, they get the freeze. For you League players out there, doesn't that remind you of Veigar's Event Horizon? Anyway, in addition, when you use her skill during her Absolution or Confession mode, she deals an application of her Forte and Power and Heavy attack. Except it does not count as a heavy attack, it's just an instance of damage. Compared to other DPS characters whose S6 makes them Jesus, the offensive increase you get from Phoebe's S4 through S6 are not quite as substantial. In terms of what's the best bang for your buck, I would say Dolphin players can comfortably settle for S3. Finally, her gear. As per usual, her signature weapon is the best on her, courtesy of the massive 36% crit rate on substat and the synergy it has with Spectro Frazzle. Conveniently though, Stringmaster is also a 36% crit rectifier and gives decent pressure for Phoebe as well, because remember, Phoebe can deal 2 instances of skill damage just like Yinlin, so if you want, you can always use Yinlin's personal weapon on Phoebe for the general stats. It's only about an 8% loss in DPS give or take. Although interestingly, Toto's weapon can work as well. It's a noticeable margin weaker than Phoebe's signature, but the 72% crit damage and basic attack boost does work on her. Sadly, you do miss out on the overwhelming 52% on Outro, but it's not a bad option there. The best 4-star option would be the R5 Augment or Ocean's Gift for free-to-plays. Overall, Phoebe has quite possibly the best arrangement of weaponry to choose from out of any character. Finally, Echoes. Echo set's obviously Eternal Radiance, having talked about it at the beginning of the video. For her main Echo, Nightmare Morning Ikes does bonus damage against Spectro Frazzled enemies and gives a passive 12% bonus to Spectro damage. For main stats, go for a crit rate 4 cost, Spectro damage on 3 cost, and attack on 1 cost. For substats, get energy to around 10% or 25% if you're playing her as a sub DPS. From then on, crit stats, attack percent, then heavy or basic attack percent, whichever one you come across. Her build is more or less the same regardless of the role you take. All in all, Phoebe is an excellent unit, does a ton for your team as a main attacker, and can even moonlight a bit in support, which has the potential to expand in the future if we get more Spectro DPS units. Without question, a worthwhile pull, especially for those who don't have Jinchi, and even for those who do have Jinchi. Plus, look at her, she's so cute. Every arena seated character is peak visual design. Anyway, that wraps up my analysis and discussion on Phoebe. Let me know in the comments down below what you think of her and if you plan to pull for her or not. Also, if you have any questions, you're always welcome to ask. That's it for today, so if you enjoyed the video, a like and subscribe would be much appreciated. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter @ForestFairM, join my Discord server, and check out my other Wuwa character first impressions videos if you haven't yet. But till next time, thanks so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Take care.